Hey guys, James here from Real Bias Gaming. I'm going to go over today why I think review scores for video games are unnecessary, compare game reviews to movie reviews, and then what I do personally to make game scores in games irrelevant to the channel and why that's a good thing. So, in a recent article from the Penny Arcade Report, some odd practices were brought to light not only about Metacritic, but in the review industry in general. I want you guys to read the article for yourselves, but I'll sum it up for you here. So, pretty much it says that it's very easy for publishers to say to a media outlet, hey, if your score is high enough for our game, you can publish your review X days before anybody else. Now, this is, in a basic sense, cheating. The publisher is cheating because they're artificially upping their own review scores, and the review site is cheating because they're being dishonest, they're not upholding their journalistic integrity, and all that just so they can get their review up first on the internet for people to find. Now, why would publishers put pressure on media outlets to do such a thing? It's because there's tons of research on how scores for video games affect sales. Basically, in its basic sense, a game with a score starting with the number 9 is usually going to sell more than a game starting with the number 8. Now, this seems to make sense, and in a perfect world, game rating scores would be 100% accurate all the time, and thus they would reflect actual sales. But this is not a perfect world, except people seem to treat it like it is when it comes to game scores. So publishers want their games to hit a certain score so that when people search for their game on Google and the first thing they read is 10 out of 10 from the first link on Google, they just go buy it, simple as that. Now, I could go into all kinds of examples and whatnot, but that is mostly taken care of by the Penny Arcade article and plenty of others on the internet already. I want to talk about why scores absolutely cannot accurately tell you how good a video game is. Now first, games are many things. Not only can you separate, usually, the story from the actual gameplay or the graphics from the voice acting, but also certainly the multiplayer aspects from the single-player aspects. Call of Duty, for instance, it consistently has a robust and entertaining multiplayer, but often the single player is kind of hit or miss. Lots of people don't even play the single player at all. Why then would you score both parts, single player and multiplayer, and then just average the scores for the entire game and say that's its overall score, if you have two completely separate components in it? Now, I bought Modern Warfare 2 a couple years ago for the single-player campaign, and I loved it. Multiplayer was enjoyable and I played some, but it had its problems, and eventually it got boring for me. How then could I possibly come up with a number to rate each individual part, then come up with a rating that encompasses those two numbers into an actual meaningful overall score? I mean, then let's take a game like Deus Ex Human Revolution, a game I loved, but I loved it because of the art style, the impressive graphics, and plus, until the very ending, I was engrossed by the overall narrative. The gameplay for me was just a means to an end for that game, but I know for a fact there are plenty of people out there who don't give a single crap about the story or anything like that, so they just want tight and satisfying gameplay. But if I gave the single player a 9.5, then how will those people who don't care about the story know that I gave it that high score because of the narrative and art direction? Well, I mean, the obvious answer is that they should just read or watch the full review. But then if I, as a reviewer, explain everything about what is good and bad about a game in the full review, and I explain what I, as the reviewer, enjoyed the most, what is the point of giving it a score anyways? The score just ends up being a pure personal opinion just as much as the words in the review article are. The score is just a redundancy then, but it's one that can throw people off track because people put their own interpretations into that score despite what the reviewer actually says. Now, this brings me to my second point. Games are not given scores by accident. They're rated like this because long before video games were around, people reviewed movies. Movies are probably the closest medium to a video game that you can get. Now, one major difference between games and movies is what the product is that the reviewer actually gets in their hands. For a movie, it's almost inevitable that the complete and final version that the reviewer watches is the complete and final version that everybody in the theaters will watch. But for a video game, rarely nowadays do you have a completed game on launch. Often there's a day one patch, or at least a patch in the first couple weeks, or people are still working on the game just weeks before the launch date, and a reviewer may get a completely unfinished product, and thus it'll actually skew their review because they got it early. Now, a second major difference is the relevance of fun in a movie review. Now, while this can be a valid thing to comment on and how enjoyable a movie was, in the final review, it's oftentimes irrelevant. The Hurt Locker did not win Best Picture because of how much fun the Academy had during those 2 hours in the theater. You know, I don't enjoy movies like The Life Aquatic or The Departed because of how much fun I had during those 2 hours watching it. A score can be relevant for a movie because in the end it's all about how original that movie was, or how well the movie taught us a life lesson, or just how well it was written and directed. In a video game, however, the final criterion is usually how much fun the game was, how enjoyable of an experience that game is. And the answer as to how enjoyable that game was, it cannot just be a 10 out of 10, you know, because that experience is going to be different for everyone. It's much better to answer that by saying, if you enjoy blank in your games, then you will love this game. Now, finally, my third point, which is that I have no intention of giving games scores now or ever. I don't need them because my whole goal is to dissect these games. I don't want to give cramped 5-minute video reviews with a score at the end. I want to take my time and really dig into what really makes these games good or bad, and talk about things like multiplayer and single player, graphics and gameplay separately. Scoring, in my opinion, is irrelevant and pretty much worthless. Instead, we should be able to find in the gaming journalism industry people who we can trust not to give in to publisher pressure and can be relied upon to give us accurate descriptions of games in their reviews without relying on a scoring system. So, what do you think? Do you rely on on scores for your games? Do you just look at the score to choose whether you buy or don't buy a game? I mean, what is your main criteria for a good game? What is your criteria for a good review? If you disagree or agree with me or the article from Penny Arcade, let me know in the comment section below.